Alrighty. So thank you all for coming. This is the Cameron Murray's lecture today, organised by the UQ PP Society, so UQ's Politics, Philosophy and Economics Society. We're essentially our student organisation representing politics, philosophy and economics students and those who have an interest in either of the disciplines. So I'll obviously say, if you want more events like this, to encourage you to chuck us a like on Facebook or Instagram, and also to get a membership if you haven't already. We'd also like to give a thank you to Frontier Economics, a microeconomic consultancy firm who have kindly agreed to kind of financially help us out in putting on this event. So yeah, we'd just like to extend our kind of warm regards to them for providing funds while also interfering in no way with what we actually did. So that was very kind of them. And more information on Frontier Economics, www.frontier-economics.com.au. So lastly, I'd obviously like to thank you, Cameron, for coming here and generously donating his time to us today. Cameron Murray is obviously an economist specializing in property and urban development, environmental economics, rent seeking and corruption. He is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Henry Halloran Trust at the University of Sydney. He is also the co-author of the popular Game of Mates, How Favours Believe the Nation, which I know a fair few of you will have read. He'll be speaking on the topic of why politicians must pretend to want cheap housing. So without much further ado, I'd like to, again, thank you, Cameron, and hand over to him.
Ooh, look at that. Well, thanks, Oliver, for that lovely introduction. Thanks, everybody else involved in the Politics, Philosophy and Economics Society for putting this event on. It's my absolute pleasure to speak with you today about a topic that's pretty dear to my heart. I've been a renter, a home buyer, a landlord, and I have many friends and family that have a lot of housing concerns. So the question that has puzzled me for a long time is the topic of today's lecture: why politicians must pretend to want cheap housing. So let me start with my thesis here. Much of the contemporary debate about affordability is a distraction. It's promoted by vested interests and reinforced by political incentives. The proposed solutions are usually policies that favour property owners, not renters or buyers. Now, the first way we know something is off is the language. Affordability, it's a beautifully vague word. It's a word that works nicely as a covert signal. That is, a word that means something different to your target audience compared to others. Aspiring homeowners can be led to believe that the word implies cheaper prices and cheaper rents while they're saving. They feel their concerns acknowledged. Something is being done for them. For homelessness and public housing advocates, the word affordability implies a boost to public housing investment and more non-market options for the most needy. The word makes it appear that something's being done for them too. But the beauty of the covert signal is that the true meaning is known only to the target audience. In this case, it's large property owners and developers. They know that affordability means that absolutely nothing will be done that puts the value of their property assets at risk. To them, the word is an invitation to participate in the next great property scam. They know that to appear to be doing something about affordability, their political mates will simply ask them what policies they want. Whatever tax break, rezoning or subsidy they come up with will then become the nation's new affordability policy. In his 1946 essay on politics in the English language, George Orwell wrote, and I quote, when there's a gap between one's real and one's declared aims, one turns, as it were, instinctively to long words and exhausted idioms, like cuttlefish squirting out ink. Affordability is a long word that hides the real aim of boosting the asset portfolios of major property owners behind the declared aim of making housing cheaper for residents. So why must politicians play this Orwellian game of pretend at all? There are three political economy issues at play. First, the electoral logic. John Howard is claimed to have said that he never met anyone who complained about their house going up in value. 65% of Australian households own their own home, with 18% being landlords, and both sets of property owners skewed towards the top of the income distribution. Contrast this with only 100,000, roughly, households, that's 1%, who are new buyers each year, and the few percent more that want to be new buyers. You can see that the electoral calculus is heavily on the side of higher prices, not lower prices. Think about it. Australia's housing stock is worth about $10 trillion, not billion, trillion. That's $1 million per household on average. It's the largest asset class in the economy by far. A policy that reduced house prices by 30% would wipe $3 trillion from the balance sheets of Australian homeowners, hitting the highest income households and the most politically influential households the hardest. The electoral calculus is not in favour of cheaper housing. The second logic at play is what I call the personal finances logic. Politicians themselves own a lot of housing. Analysis of the financial disclosures of federal politicians in 2017 found that the 226 federal politicians owned 525 residential properties between them. That's 2.3 on average. If these were valued at the $1 million average, that's over $500 million between them. There are another 600 or so state politicians, again, filled predominantly with homeowners and landlords, and roughly 500 councils with over 4,500 elected councillors who are heavily represented by property interests. So altogether, we have about 5,600 politicians in Australia across all levels. If they owned the 2.3 properties on average, each worth $1 million, that's $13 billion of property assets. A 30% price decline would wipe $4 billion from their own balance sheets. What are the chances of 5,000 people conspiring to wipe billions from their own balance sheets? And of course, those of their family and friends for no direct benefit. It's implausible. Finally, there's the macroeconomic logic that points to why there is this game of pretend continuing. For 3 decades, Australia and its peer nations have used the housing market as a macroeconomic stabilisation tool. When economic trouble appears on the horizon, we lower interest rates to boost house prices. And by repeatedly doing so, the interest rate ratchet has led to massive asset repricing in Australia and globally since the 1990s. We call this property price regulation monetary policy, another phrase that might make George Orwell proud. Let me read from the Reserve Bank of Australia's published explanation of the mechanism by which they think monetary policy affects the economy. And I'll quote, "Lower interest rates support asset prices such as housing and equities by encouraging demand for assets. One reason for this is because the present value of future income is higher when the interest rates are lower. Higher asset prices also increase the equity of an asset that is available for banks to lend against. This can make it easier for households and businesses to borrow. An increase in asset prices increases people's wealth. This can lead to higher consumption and housing investment as households generally spend some of their wealth." End quote. It's not a secret. It's in the economics textbooks. It's published on central bank websites all around the world. This is why house prices have boomed on the back of the low interest rate response to the pandemic in 2020. They boom because we designed our macroeconomic stabilisation policy as a high house price insurance system. So big and important are housing markets to the overall state of the economy. I've heard informed people say that Australia is a housing market with an economy attached. And I couldn't put it better myself. The RBA's Lucy Ellis said at a recent housing supply inquiry, "There are no examples internationally of large falls in nominal housing prices that have occurred other than through a significant reduction in the capacity to pay, such as a recession and high unemployment." There are no examples anywhere in the world where cheaper prices have been engineered politically. Price declines only happen as an undesirable side effect of an economic disaster. And when that happens, we try and ensure those prices with lower rates. So that's the three main political economy issues: the electoral logic, the personal finances logic, and the macroeconomic logic. And they reveal the motivation for keeping house prices high and hence only pretending to care. Given these realities, what real choice does even the most community-minded politician have? The political sweet spot is to ensure economic returns to property owners stay high through price growth and rental returns, while pretending to want the exact opposite. Anyone who does differently will be replaced. We saw how big a deal relatively minor changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax were in the 2017 federal election. So if what I say is true, then the tax breaks, rezoning or subsidies now being sold to us as affordability solutions must be anything but. Instead of benefiting home buyers and renters, they must be benefiting sellers and landlords, the other side of the housing market equation. With some simple logic, we should be able to see them for what they are and hence cut through some of the intentionally vague language of the current housing debate. So before I dig into these fake solutions, I need to take a quick aside into the economics of asset pricing. High housing asset prices can be a bit of a distraction when thinking about making housing cheaper for residents. After all, dwellings are assets priced based on yields, that is their rental income and their capital gains. We don't talk about the price of BHP shares when we talk about iron ore affordability. The housing product is occupation, not ownership. It's not widely acknowledged, but in the 2018 to 2021 period, and especially 2020 and 2021, first home buying boomed in Australia to be about 180,000 per year on average, compared to under 100,000 per year the 5 years prior. Now, why is that? Because the price of renting the money needed to buy a home fell compared to the price of renting the home. For the same price as renting a home for, say, $20,000 a year, you could rent $400,000 at 5% interest back in 2017. By 2020, you could rent $670,000 at a 3% interest rate for that same $20,000 a year price. That's a 67% higher asset price at the same annual price of occupancy. What happened in the past decade, and much more in the past 2 years, was an asset repricing process whereby the free gains from shifting from renting housing to renting money were exploited. This process led to rising asset prices to close the differential, just as intended by low interest rate monetary policy. The Home Builder Grant added a temporary boost to first home buying, as did the fallout of the 2017 Banking Royal Commission, which led to banks repricing the interest rate for home owner mortgages compared to investor mortgages, increasing the interest rate advantage for home buyers. It's quite funny because in May 2020, during the most panicked period of COVID, I predicted that home prices were more likely to rise 20% than fall 20% over the next 18 months. Most major banks and economic commentators were warning of large price falls on the back of low immigration and high unemployment. In fact, on social media, many told them to hand back my degrees, and I was called many names for this outrageous prediction. But of course, as I knew, and very few others did, the interest rate effect, coupled with some other cyclical factors, which I'm not going to talk about in detail, swamped any other effect when it came to property asset pricing. So we need to be careful about using asset prices as a measure of the price of housing occupation. So yeah, let me go on. When you hear commentary, for example, about high price to income ratios of housing, what you're actually hearing is that Australian residential property assets have low yields. There's no direct indication of whether housing is expensive or cheap to actually occupy. Which leads us to the question of, well, what is the price of occupation? Well, it's the rental price. And where does that come from? The answer to that question is very much ignored in housing policy debate. The short answer is that rents reflect household incomes. Since we've started collecting data in the 1990s, we can see that private renters in Australia have consistently spent 20% of their income on rents. It's only varied in the 19 to 21% range in 25 years. So why would rent be so consistent relative to incomes? If rents were priced at, say, 10% of local incomes, what people do is they move to better locations or bigger homes, spending more on housing until they find that there's no net benefit to them of spending less on other goods and more on housing. So the reason that households spend 20% when they pay the market price rather than 5% or 10%, because that's part of our human preference for housing over other goods. If we could somehow change everybody's mind about how much of their income they'd spend on housing, we could get market rents to be much lower or maybe higher if we all change our mind and decide to spend more. We can see this income effect play out since 2020. As people moved from inner city locations to regions, those higher incomes shifted with them, leading to big rental adjustments in regional towns and rental price falls in inner city locations in Sydney and Melbourne. Now, I expect that to be a short-term adjustment and not a long-run trend, as I say, because it's driven by the relocation of the incomes. To me, the real social issue in housing is that renters get stuck in bidding wars where incomes are the firepower. More unequal incomes across the economy make renting more difficult in areas that become popular with high-income households. Long-term renters in Australia's regional towns are having a terrible time right now because of this. So this is why traditionally home ownership has been a desirable policy goal. It allows households to avoid ongoing price competition in the rental market. It helps distribute the ownership of property assets, and it reduces housing costs later in life. Renting is a bad place to be in the property market in the long term. Another issue that arises due to high property asset prices is that they advantage existing owners who have access to equity. Think about the bank of mum and dad. And it makes it harder for those saving for a deposit. Remember though, this is the intended monetary policy outcome of increasing equity for asset owners to borrow against. This is the flip side of the same thing we have planned for. The deposit hurdle is why the age of first home ownership in Australia increased from 27 in 1980 to nearly 40 today. And the share of home owning households aged under 35 fell from 60% to 45%. Contrast this with the period of, say, 1950 to 1966. Home ownership increased from 52% to 71%. We got that outcome in a political environment where cheap housing really was desired, and with heavy-handed public involvement in the market. There were rent controls, mass-scale public land development and construction, and the sale of that housing to residents at a discount, public loans for construction and restrictions on private bank finance. Just like we solved unequal access to healthcare with public hospitals and public health insurance, we solved unequal access to housing in that period the same way. But none of these policies that worked then are even part of today's debate. So let me summarize this rambling housing economics lesson that we need for context before we get back to some politics and fake solutions. First, the asset price of housing doesn't reflect the price of occupying housing. It mostly reflects prevailing interest rates. Second, rents reflect local incomes. Third, higher asset prices and more unequal incomes lead to more households stuck renting and saving for a deposit, leading to later and lower home buying. And fourth, previous housing successes involved major public intervention. But this political sweet spot today requires ignoring all of this, because the real intention of pretending to care about cheap housing is to provide a cover story for political favours. Rezoning, tax breaks and subsidies are the main game. Let's look at these in turn and see if the solutions can be undone by some simple logic in the process. And In doing so, I hope I can arm you with some arguments that cut through the word games that dominate the debate. So first up is the upzoning solution. The tale we hear is that of the poor, downtrodden property developer just trying to build cheap homes for people, but being extorted by the government at every turn through zoning laws and fees and charges. Now, it seems weird to say it like that, but the language we use is important if we want to change things. Now, there's two reasons why this story makes no sense. First, large property owners are mostly sophisticated and politically connected. I studied 6 major land rezoning decisions in Queensland from 2007 to 2012. I looked at the landowners inside the rezoned areas and those with equivalent, similar sized land just across the road next door outside those boundaries. But they didn't get rezoned. To determine if I could predict the rezoning boundary, I looked at political donations. I created a network of connections of every landowner using corporate records, lobbyist and political donation records, biographies of former politicians, and I mapped over 250,000 relationships onto the 12,000 landowners, individuals and companies in the network. I found that network connections were highly predictive of which landowners got their land rezoned for housing and which did not. So the story that these major property owners and developers are terrible at getting the rules changed in their favour flies in the face of the evidence. I was also able to observe in my data that change in land values due to these zoning decisions. Those upzoned areas increased in value $710 million more than the neighbouring properties when I compared their growth in value over time. And I've previously estimated that about $19 billion a year is given to landowners across the country through rezoning decisions. Indeed, Canberra charges a fee of 75% of the value gain from upzoning, something Victoria's copied with their 50% windfall gains tax. The same developers lobbying for their rezoning to make housing cheaper seem to get very upset when the giveaways they get in the process are halved. Maybe it wasn't about making housing cheaper after all. This leads us to the second failure of logic in this story. If mass upzoning decreases dwelling prices, why would an industry that makes money from selling new homes lobby for it? It's completely contrary to their financial interests. A couple of years ago, I did a study based on the data from the annual reports of Australia's top 12 publicly listed housing developers. They had billions worth of zoned and undeveloped land on their balance sheets and made hundreds of millions of dollars a year in revenues from selling that land for housing. If what they say is true, then I expect the following types of comments to be made in board meetings of developers if they successfully got mass rezoning. Whoops, our lobbying worked, and now we have to write off billions from our balance sheets because the value of our 50,000 zoned but undeveloped housing sites has collapsed. It's a fantasy. Either these guys are financially irresponsible, or the way they claim the property market works, that rezoning will result in the market being flooded with cheap housing, is wrong. After all, I don't see Stockland shareholders kicking out their executives for lobbying for more competition and cheaper prices through rezoning. Developers like rezoning for more density on their sites, on the sites they own, because it increases the value of their site, whether they build or not. But it doesn't make them panic and sell faster and reduce prices. The optimal rate of new sales per period is the same regardless of that density. If it was optimal to sell faster to increase the value of their revenues before, it would be optimal regardless of how many additional dwellings you could sell later in the future. This is a built-in speed limit in the market and it's known as the absorption rate. The current federal inquiry into housing affordability and supply, major housing developers were asked under oath if they thought it was possible for mass rezoning to reduce dwelling asset prices by a hypothetical 20%. Back to where they were 10 months ago. None did. None said under oath it would make a difference. Let me quote them. The chair of the inquiry, Felinsky, says, "Is it not your view that if we increase the amount of supply, prices will go down?" Property developer 1, "I don't think that's the case." Property developer 2, "My view is consistent with Richard's. Rezonings won't necessarily lead to lower prices." Felinsky, "Do you think if state and local governments rezoned more land to allow greater supply that you could see dwelling prices drop 20%? Property developer 3, "No, Straight out, I concur with some of the comments before. It's not going to create that much difference. I'm not saying these housing developers are doing something wrong by responding to market incentives when accumulating property and drip feeding to meet the market and maximize their returns. But as we've known for centuries, property is another name for monopoly. The private property market won't behave competitively. You can't make them. When we do see panic in the market and sellers being competitive, we call it a market crash and bail everyone out with low interest rates. This is why traditionally the market outcome for housing was seen as a problem, not a solution. It's why non-market systems to provide access are the only way any nation has massively reduced the inequalities inherent in private property, especially housing. The next fake solution is the tax breaks that we need for the corporate build-to-rent housing projects. Somehow, if we replace landlords who own just a few properties and have them managed professionally by real estate agents with large institutional investors that own many properties and have them professionally managed by real estate agents, then I don't know, something happens. It's never made explicit what exactly, but it's tied to the word affordability, and like this, the ink out of the squid, it's just another long word and exhausted idiom to hide the real policy aim. If the experience so far is anything to go by, this solution will turn out to be a multi-billion-dollar giveaway to existing large property owners with no benefits to housing occupants. There are two existing projects to show what to expect. On the Gold Coast is Australia's first and largest build-to-rent project called Smith Collective. It's the former Commonwealth Games Athletes Village. Despite record tight rental markets, this project with 1,251 dwellings that were completed in 2018 was on a staged release strategy over 3 years. And the manager of the project told me, and I'll quote, "They don't want to flood the rental market." Instead, they left hundreds of brand new homes vacant for years to keep their rents up. In Sydney, Mirvac's Live build-to-rent project at Olympic Park, they brag that their rents are typically 10 to 30% higher than the local market rate. The rental prices there last year were $535 a week for a one-bedroom apartment, $615 for a two-bed, and over $1,000 a week for a three-bedroom apartment. To maximise their economic return, they focused on the premium market with packaged gyms, facilities, appliances to sell a more hotel-like experience. This is what tax breaks on GST and land tax for build-to-rent landlords are going to deliver. I also wonder sometimes where all these sites for build-to-rent projects seem to magically appear from. If you believe the rezoning story, there aren't any spare development sites. The market for buying new homes can't be satisfied, but now there are many spare sites all over the country to allocate instead to this build-to-rent model. Perhaps the rezoning story is a lie. And there are plenty of development sites around, but the owners of them are looking for ways to improve their return with changes to the rules in their favour. The third solution we're sold, the third pretend solution, are subsidies. Sometimes they're grants to buyers in the form of cash subsidies like the first home buyers grant. Sometimes it's a tax break on or a stamp duty discount. These typically end up raising housing asset price since buyers take into account the total purchase cost, property plus taxes and costs. It's a bit like if there was a tax on buying Apple shares. The price would be lower to account for the cost of the tax, so that the total cost of buying the return is the same. When the tax is removed, the share price rises by that amount, so for the buyer, the total purchase price remains unchanged. These subsidy policies mostly favour existing owners and home sellers, with new home buyers getting only a small share of the subsidy for themselves. Sometimes we subsidise rents. These typically end up subsidising landlords. For example, the National Rental Affordability Scheme paid billions more to landlords than landlords gave as rental discounts to tenants, which is why that scheme is finishing soon. While subsidies can work to make housing cheaper for occupants, they usually also involve a big giveaway to existing home sellers and landlords. So we have three main non-solutions: rezoning, tax breaks for build to rent, and subsidies that aren't really doing much for current housing renters and aspiring homeowners. But these policies do have major advantages to landlords and developers. I think part of the confusion is that we're using vague language to hide the true objectives, and we end up confusing policies that benefit landlords and developers with policies that benefit the people who purchase housing from them. Even though the economic interests of the two groups are fundamentally in opposition, we still call a policy that benefits landlord an affordable housing policy, even if it doesn't benefit their tenants. So there's one final policy I want to talk about before I wrap up, and I hope we have a great discussion. And I think it gets to the heart of the economic conflict between current property owners on one side of the market and buyers and renters on the other side. And that is shared equity. Has anyone heard of this? Oh, good, because I'm going to explain it. Most states have these programs, and the Grattan Institute, an Australian think tank, recently released a report proposing a national scheme. The idea is that the government will stump up 30% of the purchase price of a home for a homeowner and take a 30% equity stake, so that the home buyer only needs a loan and cash to cover 70% of the asset price. But they get to occupy the whole home, not 70% of it, and can buy back the government's 30% share at any future time. So this scheme reduces the deposit hurdle, reduces the loan size and ongoing costs for buyers, allowing them to become homeowners sooner. And it does so without affecting the asset price, and hence its political popularity at the moment. The payoff to the government is that because house prices typically rise over time, at least with the rate of income growth in the economy, even without changing interest rates, because rental growth will grow in line with the incomes in the economy, whenever the government's share is bought back by the homeowner, they'll make a return on their 30% investment. For example, if the government stumps up $150,000 for a 30% stake in a $500,000 home, if it gets repaid or purchased back by the homeowner in 10 years when the home's worth $750,000, the equity stake is then worth $225,000, and that's a 50% return on that equity stake the government took over the 10 years. You got it? Yeah? Good. If my numbers are wrong, you just yell out. So it really seems like magic. Make housing cheaper for home buyers without the political suicide of reducing market prices. But has anyone noticed anything weird about how the government makes money under this policy? Let me restate what's happening. The government is buying 30% of someone's home, letting the owner of the other 70% reside in their share for free. The government only gets its money back when the property is sold, and this makes the government money. If this is true, then the following should also be true. The government buys 100% of someone's home, and the owner buys the other 0%. The government lets them reside in their share for free and only gets their money back when the property is sold, and this makes the government money. It truly does mean that a government agency could undertake the kind of build-to-rent projects the private financial sector loves on their balance sheet, let residents own those dwellings for free, covering only council rates, insurance and maintenance, and that would make the government money because the capital gains would exceed the funding costs. The government's the only organisation that thinks they can't make money in housing at the moment. So the pretend solutions were all about making more money for private landlords and investors without any obligation to actually reduce the price of occupying housing. But if the government can simply be a landlord, investor or developer, it could use those financial returns to provide occupants cheaper housing, either through a discounted rent or a discounted purchase price, while still covering their financial costs. Now, I'm generally wary of the government should do its solutions to problems like this. Typically, that's the start of a solution, not the end. The details matter of how you design an institution to do this effectively and ensure that what you're creating gets the low housing costs you desire. I've actually explained how to do this in a proposal I call Housemate, which copies the Singapore model of public home ownership. Unlike Australia over the past 4 decades, where home ownership has both declined and concentrated amongst the older households, Singapore has boosted home ownership from 60% to 88% by providing cheap public supplied home ownership option to every citizen. I actually spoke to a local council representative this week from a regional town about some problems they're having with locals being priced out of housing because, as we've seen, high-income households are moving to the regions. This council has land they would like to use for housing, and they asked my advice. I said, just build homes on it and then let people live there for a low rental price. It can't be that easy, they said. Why not? I said. We've been led to believe that housing is a difficult problem when it's not. We only made it difficult because we eliminated from the debate the only effective policies that require active public involvement in production of housing and housing markets. The government housing interventions in the 1950s and 60s worked to get the outcome of cheap housing that we say we want today. But Australia then was a very different place. Home ownership was only 50% after the war. There was immense political pressure for returned soldiers and their families, to make cheap housing options available. Instead of the 3 political economy issues that generate today's game of pretend, there was just one, the personal finances logic of the political class. But it was overridden by the electoral logic, and the macroeconomy then was managed by public spending in a similar manner to how it was in the wartime period. So there was no macroeconomic conflict there either. When we really dig down, we can see housing solutions that worked in the past and that work today elsewhere. The solutions are not difficult, but the politics is. Until we stop pretending, nothing will change. Thank you. Let's have some.
Okay, so thank you very much for that, Cameron. What we'll do now after that is go through and have a kind of a short Q&A session. It's okay. I'll go around with a microphone, and if anyone's got a question, just to kind of ask it, and then Cameron, you kind of endeavour to answer. With that in mind, does anyone have any?
Don't put your hands up at once.
Yeah.
All right.
So you touched on it, but zoning law deregulation is often touted as a panacea for our housing crisis. And what you described is often the process of campaigning for specific zones, and that the laws regarding that upzoning to be diminished for the benefit of property developers. Would there be any benefit for a universal deregulation of zoning laws across our entire economy?
That's a common argument. Did everyone hear it? So instead of rezoning just one lot or another lot, just do everything, and then it's a free-for-all. Well, New Zealand's done that. In Auckland, they did it in 2016. They increased the zone capacity by some enormous factor, like 6 times the total stock of housing. And then they subsequently overrode all local laws with a 3 dwellings of 3 stories on every residential site in the nation law a few years after that. And property prices there increased more than any city in Australia since 2016. So I guess I view it differently. You want to plan the city you want, and if that's what you want, then do it. But don't expect it to solve the normal private property market outcomes. We've got to understand what this market does and doesn't do, and it doesn't, undermine its own value. by reducing prices. So yes, New Zealand's the best experiment of that. And I guess we'd hoped for more. It would be great if this worked a treat, but I can't really see any evidence yet.
I guess this is more of a question of clarification than anything else. But in the alternative model is the idea that the government takes over the function of acquiring land, producing houses, and then getting it in the hands of prospective homeowners? Or are they more in the business of sort of commissioning projects and then purchasing the developments that have been completed by developers that might already exist in the market?
My proposal? Yeah, either. The trick is essentially to allocate however the housing is produced under what institutional arrangement, whether you just purchase a project someone else is doing or you purchase land and design the building and build it yourself. It doesn't really matter what that arrangement is. What matters is that you allocate to people who don't own property, the property at a cheap price. So in Singapore, for example, if you're a citizen aged over 21, and you got to apply as a couple, you show up to the HDB and you say, I'm here at I would like a house. They have a lot of projects going on. There's also a resale market in their model. You can also purchase someone else's HDB dwelling at a negotiated price. But what you always get there is the option to buy a new home at a cheap price. And when I say cheap price, I'm talking like $150,000 to $300,000 for a new three-bedroom apartment, with additional subsidies if you live near your parents, and they will also provide you a loan at a discounted rate, and you can also use your compulsory savings as a deposit and to repay the loan. So most Singapore citizens, when they go to get a home, it costs them nothing because their compulsory savings pays for everything. They show up. Can I have a three-bedroom house? Either you buy it off the secondary market or you buy a new one. Cash flow is unchanged. And they expect it. It's like Medicare there. It's like public hospitals. The government actually gets rewarded for building better and bigger public housing, because just like, the governments here get awarded for building big public hospitals, they get rewarded there for housing projects.
I just want to ask about like the national sentiment side of things. So obviously the housing bubble and housing market is a big sort of behavioral driven sort of a bubble. And I was just wondering, obviously you make quite a compelling thesis, but how do you actually change the national sentiment, and like what's the way we can sort of project what your thesis is into like public discourse? And like obviously there's a big sort of role of narratives, and I guess I know that like Tima Karan and Joe Walker have spoken about understanding the housing market as like an availability cascade. So like I don't know if these are useful perspectives in terms of like understanding it, but I guess my main question is, how can we use the narrative side to sort of hijack the national sentiment so we can make your thesis more salient for buyers?
Good question. I mean, I'm trying to do my part today. Arm you all with some arguments and my views on things, and you don't have to believe everything I say, right? But hopefully it allows you to see the debate differently and come up with your own ways of explaining what your concerns are. I think at the end of the day, home ownership is just going to decline until homeowners are the majority and politically organized. I think that's how it goes. If you look historically, this happens routinely over time. I mean, in the 1870s, there was a boom. In the 1890s, there was a boom and bust in the US and Australia. And the same debates were happening there. And you know, the most popular, have you guys read Progress and Poverty by Henry George? Yeah, so it was the most popular book for 2 decades in the whole English-speaking world. And the idea is there, well, how come everyone can be so rich if you own land and so poor if you don't, all at the same time? And I don't buy everything he has to say, but my point being, this is a long-standing issue, and things are going to go in waves. And I think, you know, we saw the sort of post-war boom and the political motivation for, you know, very hands-on government to sort of convert the war effort into housing the soldiers. And we're in a different cycle now, and it's hard to know how far that can go before things change. I don't think, you know, we can talk about it differently, and I think it'd be great to have more concrete debates rather than just hand-wavy, vague, oh, the build-to-rent sector is really good, you know, we've got to equalize the treatment of taxes. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? It means you want less tax to build something to rent at 30% more. Like, what are we doing here? So if we can talk a bit more concretely in the meantime, I can't see anything wrong with that. It's got to be positive.
Go to the other side of the room and then back. So up there.
So you mentioned Henry George. What advantages do you think the sort of shared equity or sort of public housing Singapore-esque model has over just a sort of flat capital gains tax on land, or a single land tax, as many Georgists would propose?
Good question. Some Georgists don't like me because I don't think you can get that far with land value taxes. Yes, it's a good sort of asset tax, and yes, it's slightly redistributive, and yes, it's more efficient than taxes on incomes. Fine, do that. But at the end of the day, if you can either redistribute the wealth of the land by taxing it and redistributing it, or you can literally just give everyone a piece as well, right? So the thing about the tax, though, is you have these life cycle issues that come up because you retire, you don't want to move out of your place, but your suburb's booming because all the rich people like whatever, the business you work for your entire life. And you undermine that, and now you've got to pay this land tax in your retirement, right? So in some ways, I see it undermining the security. The very reason for home ownership is to avoid having to pay the rent. The land tax solution is pay the rent to the government and let them redistribute it. And I'm a bit like, well, there's a bit of conflict there. I don't think it's as clean cut. Yeah.
Your preference would be just very widespread home ownership, so rents are accumulated by the owner-occupier, rather than...
Look, yeah, you know, I have arguments at the left of politics on that too. They all want, you know, the government should own the houses, and, you know, it should be social housing in this. I'm like, well, why? You can just give someone a free house and they can live in it, and their children will live in it. They will die. Someone will live in that house you gave to that family for free, and it will last as long as the house lasts. You don't have to micromanage it. It still gets the same effect. And so I think that's the beauty of Singapore, is it's like, we just build them and give you the option to get them. You can sell it when you want, you manage it, you renovate it, you paint it, you do whatever you want. There's a few controls, like you got to live in it for 5 years, you can't just rent it out. But it essentially makes the system a lot simpler. So yes, that's the answer.
Politicians to sort of make housing cheaper. Is that something that could become a possibility again with such like distaste of politicians now around like the housing market?
Look, I really, until the numbers change a lot, I know a lot of people who wanted cheap housing, bought a house, wanted prices to go up. Like, it's very, very common, right? It's very hard to bet against self-interest politically. I mean, you know, if the way I like to, if we send all our young people who don't own houses off to war and train them how to organize and use weapons, and then they come back and they're really angry, then maybe they will, you know, that's sort of the sort of comic book story. But if you've just given all your young angry men guns and they don't have houses, then maybe that will help. But, you know, I really think it's a numerical political game. Up the back, there's some. Where are we?
Kind of linked to what was just said before. I can't remember if it was the Grattan Institute or the Australian Institute. Basically, they showed that there's like a pretty strong link between renting in your retirement and poverty, especially if you're a single occupant. Do you think that's going to be a situation where, you know, people are going to be becoming vicious, or is it not really going to matter that much?
Yeah. Yes, that is going to become more of an issue over time. No, I don't think it's enough to sway that political calculus, essentially because of the income distribution of people who are renting in retirement. They're just not politically important people. And once you get to that age bracket, home ownership rates are closer to 90% once you're in your 60s. So although we're purchasing housing later, at the older ages, it's still very, very high. And what's happening a lot is you'll purchase a home in your 40s and you won't pay off the mortgage by the time you're 60, but what you can do is take most of your super as a lump sum in your late 50s and pay off your mortgage then. So yes, it's bad, but I don't think that group is going to ever be big enough to be politically important.
There's like a growing, like, you know, if home ownership rates are like falling, you know, at a certain rate, might that happen like way?
Oh, yeah, eventually. But I think it'll be the home ownership rate so much lower in the young. It's 45%, right? Or 40% in the under 35s, and it's 90% in the over 60s. So that slope is still going to be there. And if you have 0% under 40, someone's got to own all the houses, right? So you'll have a pretty high home ownership in retirement for a long time. It'll be the younger people that change things when nobody under 40, very few. There's one up the back there.
Hi, Cameron. Yeah, I just had a question. I'm from the Gold Coast, and on that Smith Road development that you mentioned, I think the Smith development, it's like all those places that they built for the Commonwealth Games. I know in Brisbane at the last council election, I think it was Councillor Shree proposed like a 5% vacancy levy, so that all these landlords that don't want to flood the rental market then have to pay a vacancy levy. Like, I have my own views, but what are your thoughts on that kind of proposal?
So Vancouver has one, and I think Melbourne adopted one for a while, and it doesn't really change much. There's some interesting stuff in Vancouver. So you had people with essentially parking assets, parking their money in Vancouver real estate, all of a sudden renting out these $2,000 a week mansions and 10 students showing up. But eventually people adjust to that and work out the loopholes. There's usually quite a lot, right? You can, you know, if it's a seasonal accommodation and things like that. I think it's not really the main game. It's not going to change prices much. You know, there's 10 million dwellings in Australia. There's at most 30,000 sort of vacant that you could get in there. The price elasticity is, you know, about 1. So you're talking about 0.003% price effect or rental price effect. I think it's small bickies in the grand. It's up the back there.
I'm just a bit unclear on your proposal still. So
Okay.
Government basically like commissions all the houses or whatever, they're all built. People go to the government, I need a house. And the government's like, okay, here's a house for you. You don't have to pay anything to live in it.
More detail. It's much more detail. Let me explain. Okay. If you don't own any property, remember 65% of households do, then you qualify to be an eligible buyer. If if you're an eligible buyer, the government will essentially be a mass housing developer, whether it does it or it just buys from other housing developers to get properties into the system. And you can imagine in the inner city, it'll be apartments, and in the middle rings, it'll be townhouses, and in regional towns and on the fringe, it'll be just blocks of land. And they actively participate in buying or developing those housing options. And anybody on that eligibility list can show up and put their name in the hat for something in this building, a block of land in this subdivision, whatever. And the price is essentially regulated. So in Singapore, the price essentially reflects the construction cost. So an apartment that sells in the market for say 650, 700,000, the construction cost might be 300,000. So you recover all your construction costs through the sale price, but you essentially give the land for free to those eligible buyers. So in Australia, a system like that would probably get up to around 15 to 20% of the new housing market. In Singapore, it's 90%. So 90% of all dwellings in Singapore were built by the Housing Development Board since 1960. So here it would just be an additional option. So you could buy in the private market, you could rent in the private market, or you could show up to housemate and you could get a discount house purchase. Now, what you would be giving up is the opportunity to sell in the private market. You could only sell to another eligible buyer. So you kind of create this little parallel market where you put essentially free land into the system. Can you speak up, sorry?
So you get that house for free, the government
Construction cost price you'll pay. You
pay for that. But then when the house is sold, you don't get any of the money back.
You get it all. So yeah, okay. I have a long report about this, but because anyone you can sell to also has the option to get a cheap free one, they're not going to bid up the price of yours very high, are they? Because those class of buyers can always show up and get the free one. The free land, pay for the construction cost, use their super discounted price. So in Singapore, the way it works is about like this. Let's just say a brand new property is 300 grand. You actually get additional subsidies if you buy a new one. So it really advantages that. But if you want to buy a second-hand one out of their system in the HDB resale market, you might pay, because the older ones are in better locations, you might pay 500,000. If you went to the private market to buy an equivalent one, it'd be $1 million. So the HDB, yeah, it's only 300,000 to buy, and maybe it'll go up to 500,000, but you can't sell it for $1 million because everyone who's paying the 500,000 also has the option for the $300,000 new one, right? So it sort of creates this parallel market, yeah? And that's what's worked there. And I'm not saying this is the solution, but I'm saying all solutions we have to broaden home ownership involve some kind of reallocation of the ownership of property, either through this, through selling off public housing to tenants at a discount, or whatever the case may be. Yep, there's one there.
So for your model to work, does it require either a mediated sale price placed on the owner's arm?
No. Keep the price down?
Yeah. Is there not a scenario where you're basically just having a lottery by so few people in that lottery?
Yeah. So there's a bit of a problem with phasing in because you've got 30% of people. Well, not all are going to be eligible, right? You still have to borrow $300,000, $400,000, right? You know, you have to be a certain age. You have to have a job, right? So you get a mortgage for but yes, when you start, there will be a lottery in all the projects because you haven't built up, you haven't satisfied that demand. Like, still a lot of people are going to buy their first home in the private market. In Singapore, you have to occupy the property for 5 years and you can't sell it for 5 years. And I've proposed 7 years simply because you need more time to ramp that up. Because you might win the lottery today, sell it to someone who doesn't want to wait. But if you give yourself more time to ramp it up, that sort of solves that. And in Singapore, it's quite interesting. The fact that you can make money on this is seen as a benefit, right? People don't go, oh, you got a discounted house from the government and then you made $200,000 in 10 years. People are like, yes, everybody gets free money. Like that's like a citizen dividend. It's a right to be there. And everybody thinks it's great. Now, it's not 700,000 because you can't sell it to a private, foreign investor or something. But they do feel like the same benefits of home ownership you get in the private property market are available there. It's just a parallel market. Over there, it's 90%, but here it might build up to 10 or 15%.
Just actually quickly.
You have a question?
Yeah, a question. Sorry. But so you talked earlier about, say, government incentives about why they might want to keep prices high because of politicians that owned property or whatnot.
Yeah.
If you're actually increasing the stake that government controls in housing, aren't you therefore also creating an incentive for government to keep prices high because government is a holder of a large number of these assets?
Yeah, people say that. People say that. Let me answer in a few ways. Governments sell income-producing assets all the time and make themselves poorer by doing so. So the question is, well, are governments really as financially motivated as the private interests around property? And I think that's not true. The way I don't see incentives in government to make money. I don't see, it is a risk, I'll give you that. And in the ACT, that sort of thing has happened. The ACT actually has a public land developer that owns all the undeveloped land and sells it all. Okay, so in 1911, when the ACT was created, the logic was, well, we'll create this leasehold territory. You will buy a lease and that lease will pay for the public works we need, and then your rent for that lease will go up. So essentially a public landlord, but you get 99-year lease. Your rent for that lease goes up. They've sort of unwound all the logic of that system. So after 99 years, for $260, they'll give you another 99 years. They don't want to make people rebuy their property from the state. But what they have is this public housing development. It's now called the Suburban Land Development Authority. And it's interesting because I spoke to the Chief Minister's staff 5-6 years ago now when I was doing some research in Canberra. And they were saying, oh, I've got this land rent scheme. We're trying to make houses cheaper for people. I'm like, okay, I'll have a look. And then I found out they had this public housing developer. And I said, why don't you just charge a lower price for land to people who don't own houses? And you know what he said? I think people will be really upset if we crash the price of their houses. So what we're going to do is we're going to keep drip feeding this stuff out and come up with an alternative. So I think it's very real, that political calculus, which is also why I'm now in the business of promoting the Singapore style thing of let's leave the private market do its thing. Let's create another parallel market here, where just like in private, you've got a private hospital and a public hospital. So I think to answer your question, I don't think governments are like, oh, it's going to make us more money. That's good. They're just like, what is popular? Okay. That's, I think, how they operate. So I don't see that as a risk. No. Get some up the back.
Right, just kind of following up on that. So why, if I was like 25 years old and I was looking to enter the home market with that system, why would I go into the private market? Like there'll be very low incentives for new home buyers to go into the private market. So you'll just go mainly to the public. So wouldn't just over time the government over time you would have that
just becomes the whole market.
Yeah, it becomes
correct.
The whole market.
Well, that's what happened in Singapore. I think it's going to be quite different here for a few reasons. One, the diversity of locations and housing types. Two, people want the capital gains in the private market also. So buying in the private market doesn't just give you occupancy, it gives you an asset that you can resell in the private market and get a capital gain. In this parallel market, those gains are going to be much, much smaller, right? So you're going to have not as many choices of houses, not as much financial upside when the market booms. So you might, if you can afford it, say, hey, I can tie myself to that. I've got to own it for 7 years. I can't sell it. Or I wait a few years and then I buy a bigger place in the private market and get all the financial upside and the capital gains. So, you know, that's how I see it would work.
Like one's more riskier where you could make more money, and one is like just a more safe option where you actually have a house.
As an investment, the private market's going to be better, right? As it's making money over time, yeah. But in terms of occupying, the other one will be a cheaper way to occupy.
What was if no one goes, like that private market just disappears, and then like that just will not
So
be.
what you're
actually
saying is the
available?
prices will adjust, right? And that's what I hope would happen, is that it's a bit like, you know, it's a bit like when Uber shows up and they're doing super discounts, right? Then taxis reduce their prices because you can go to Uber. Well, I hope that's what happens in housing if you create a cheap alternative. Just like the price in that market is anchored by the cheap new alternative, the price in the private market will also be anchored by the substitution between going there or there. So yeah, there will be an indirect price effect, but all those 10 million houses still exist and someone's going to own them, right? The price just might adjust. So yeah, there might be some indirect price effect, but you know, I'm pitching it as in you leave the private market, but in a sense, you're like, price effects will occur indirectly.
Just in the interest of time, we'll probably only have 3 more questions, just so people can get buses and whatnot to him.
Featuring what you're saying is basically introduce competition. So
speak up, please.
Yeah. So what I'm getting is that you're saying introduce competition to this market. So the government's a player, provide some housing, and it's something that young people that obviously don't own property can get used to, get their foot on the door, sell, and then maybe look into further investing. That regulate. There might be a way of say government intervention where they're put out if they want to use it as a economic influence tool, like the interest rate. They might put out a certain quantity of houses and then regulate the price that way. Is that something that you think they might do?
Start this parallel market, you'll want to manipulate those prices as well? Is that basically the question?
You could use it like the interest rate is like economic regulation tool. You put out a certain amount of houses.
So use it as a macroeconomic stabilization type tool by varying how much you put out.
Yeah.
Well, I guess, yeah, I mean, you could use this type of thing to stabilize the economy by employing more people to build apartment buildings and houses during a downturn. In fact, I proposed in 2020 when COVID started and everyone panicked, I said the government should go and buy all the undeveloped apartments from property developers at a discount so they can get rid of that risk and build them and own them themselves. So the developer basically, instead of panicking at COVID, sells all 100 apartments to the government at 15% discount or whatever. They've got no more risk, they're out because they're worried about COVID. You've just got 100 apartments and you've employed everybody who's going to be employed to build that. So you've got this sort of counter-cyclical investment option. It's very hard to be counter-cyclical all the time, but you could definitely try and use that tool. Yeah.
Just a couple of points looking for your commentary. PPR status and its effect in the market. So primary place of residence or principal place of residence, and how its tax-free status affects all those homeowners, which are also landlords. And then the parallel market, isn't there a potential of creating greater inequality, with you saying that in the parallel market, there's likely to be less growth compared to in the private market? Isn't there a potential to actually broaden inequality? So just, yeah, comments on those.
Principal place of residence tax exemption, I think is, my views are fairly similar to my answer here about the land tax. Is like, you know, just like in Singapore, you make money from owning your house from the system. That's seen as a good thing. I think it is seen as a good thing that everyone sort of gets a share of society's wealth by their house price rising, as long as everyone can get a piece of housing to do that. I don't think if you tax principal place of residence, either capital gains or imputed rents or something, it's going to change a whole lot. What was your second one? The inequality. Depends on how you substitute from private purchase to. If people start substituting away who would have purchased in the private market and choose this and end up getting less than they otherwise would, maybe, but then there's the other effect of people who are not going to be able to buy, be renting for decades longer or lifetime, and they'll get in. And so I don't know what the net effect is going to be. But it definitely, in terms of the cost for people to live in houses, has definitely a big effect. So the numbers I run in my report, the cost is about 50 to 70% below renting or purchasing in the private market on this type of thing, assuming you can use your super to repay the mortgage, the regulated price, and the discounted mortgage. So that's a huge number, right? The inequality, I think you're right, the outcome's ambiguous, but I can't see it having negative effects that you'd worry about.
So we just have a last question now. So let's go on. Someone who hasn't. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 Good question that I do get asked. That is a good question. I actually think it's easier here. Okay, so I've spoken to the Singapore guys. They actually have pilot projects in India, Myanmar, Brunei, Malaysia. Everyone else is trying to copy, and they're doing it. So they're doing lots of different things like detached housing and townhousing. And I think it's easier because the land is just cheaper. Like you don't have to reclaim land, you don't have to fill in land. The construction costs as you share the market value is much lower. It's just so much easier here to get sites into the system than in Singapore. So the advantage they have is that the price differentials are not as high between one suburb and another, whereas here you've got, Rockhampton and St. Lucia and, Potts Point or wherever, and Geelong. And you've got to price all these. I suspect if you trialed this, you would probably have some kind of resident criteria. So you can't apply for anything. You have to live within a certain radius of a project to be eligible for it, to sort of, well, I'll go and get one in inner city Melbourne from here, right? Go and put my name in. Maybe you need to sort of do your time living there in the private rental sector before you're eligible. The system there has evolved a lot in the last 60 years. And I think I wouldn't want to say this is the solution, we should go do it. What I would say is this is what's worked somewhere else. If we start trying this, we can evolve it and see where it goes. If it's terrible, you just stop. And what's the worst that can happen? The people who live there got a cheap house. Like, that's literally the worst outcome. But if you have some dysfunctional public organization that just isn't getting things done, well, try something else. I'm not like ideologically wedded to it. I've just looked around the world. Everybody's got the same issues except Singapore. And I'm like, well, okay, let's have a look at that, shall we? Go to any city in North America at the moment, and it's the same stuff. Look at in Germany, in Berlin, they want they want the state to acquire all the private sort of corporate buildings and rent them at cheap prices, right? There's really, I think my main message is private markets in property deliver what they do. If that's not the outcome we want, which many people don't want, we should try some alternatives that have worked elsewhere or worked here in the past. But what we shouldn't do is sort of buy into the economic stories and the myths we're told that are essentially tax breaks and gifts to the already wealthy and the current property owners. So thank you. Good question.
Thanks. Yeah, just again, thank you all for coming today. So good turnout, and thanks also, of course, to Cameron for volunteering his time to come and talk to us about that. I say, if you do have another question, you may have to angrily at Cameron on Twitter potentially. You'll see as we are out of time for today's session. But yeah, so thank you, Cameron, and say thanks again to Frontier Economics for providing the some money for this event. Just a final note as well, obviously, if you're not a member of the UQ PPE Society or don't follow us on Instagram, Facebook, that's where we kind of announce all our events. So if you're not a member and you're not on that, then if you want to keep in touch for plenty of great events like this in future, then we suggest you join us and like that. So again, that kind of concludes our evening. So it's 8 o'clock now, so you should still be able to just make it home on some of the buses before it gets a bit crazy. But again, thanks all for coming and thank you.
Thanks, everyone.